The moment the cabin door sealed at 30,000 feet, the air pressure changed. Not the gradual shift of altitude, but something heavier molecules rearranging themselves around danger like oxygen fleeing from flame. Aurelia Kensington noticed it immediately as she smoothed her black and white uniform, her honey blonde hair secured in the regulation twist that kept every strand in place. 5 years of working private aviation had taught her to read a cabin better than most people read newspapers. And today, 42,000 feet above the Atlantic, something was catastrophically wrong. The Gulfstream G650's interior hummed with engineered silence, all cream, leather, and burled walnut, providing the perfect backdrop to the tension building in the pressurized air. Aurelia's eyes flicked to the galley's polished surfaces, using the reflective chrome and glass to scan the cabin without turning her head, a trick she'd perfected during countless flights carrying passengers who valued discretion above all else. Carlos Herrera sat in seat 2A like a king on a throne he didn't need to claim. His tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than her annual salary, his silver-streaked dark hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating the kind of authority that made everyone else seem diminished simply by proximity. The other passengers, a nervous tech executive, an elderly couple, a fashion buyer, all found reasons to avoid looking directly at him. Yet everyone tracked his presence from corners of their vision, afraid to be caught acknowledging power personified. Aurelia had seen his name on the manifest, C. Herrera. Private booking, first class. She'd heard the whispered warnings from the ground crew, seen the subtle tension in the pilot's shoulders. Everyone knew who Carlos Herrera was, what he controlled, why people disappeared when they crossed him. But it was the 3 men in rows 6 and 7 that made her pulse quicken. While preparing the beverage service, Aurelia observed them through the galley's reflective surfaces. They sat with unnatural stillness, their attention fixed on Carlos with predatory focus rather than the casual awareness of recognizing celebrity. Their hands stayed folded, jackets buttoned, despite the cabin's controlled temperature. One checked his watch twice in 30 seconds, not reading the time, but marking intervals. Professionals. Waiting for their moment. Aurelia's fingers paused momentarily on the crystal tumbler she was preparing, her mind calculating risks, weighing consequences, contemplating the vast distance between professionalism and survival. She'd spent years perfecting invisibility, becoming part of the furniture of luxury aviation. Useful but unremarkable, seen but never noticed. Today, however, she would force Carlos Herrera to see her, even if it meant crossing the invisible boundary that separated crew from passengers, safety from danger. She approached his seat with practiced grace, placing his requested whiskey neat, single malt, no ice on the burled walnut table with movements as smooth as the aircraft cutting through stratospheric winds. The amber liquid caught the sunlight streaming through the oval windows. Carlos didn't acknowledge her. He never did, his dark eyes fixed on the tablet in his hands, his expression betraying nothing. Leaning forward to adjust his napkin, Aurelia spoke so softly her words barely disturbed the recycled air between them. "You're being watched. Don't let them know you saw." Her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to bruise, but her hands remained steady, a flight attendant's most valuable skill. Carlos's expression didn't change, not a single muscle betraying recognition of her warning, but his right index finger tapped once against his armrest. Acknowledgement. Aurelia straightened, her professional smile never wavering as she moved down the aisle. Behind that practiced composure, her mind raced through everything she knew about survival at altitude, about the distance between New York and London, about how quickly a routine flight could become a tomb suspended in sky. She'd just involved herself in something far larger than she'd ever anticipated, and at 39,000 feet, there was nowhere to run. Minutes passed like blood dripping from a wound, slow, heavy with consequence, dark with the certainty of violence. Aurelia moved through the cabin with choreographed normalcy, offering drinks and warm towels to passengers who had no idea they were sharing airspace with predators. Her smile never faltered. Her movements remained fluid and professional, but every nerve in her body screamed warnings in a language she'd learned to understand without ever wanting to speak. Through her peripheral vision, that survival skill honed over countless flights, she tracked the 3 men like a meteorologist watching storm systems converge. The one in 6A uncrossed his legs, a minor adjustment, meaningless to anyone not trained to read body language as precursor to action. But Aurelia saw it for what it was. Preparation. His weight shifted forward, muscles coiling beneath his expensive but generic business suit. The man in 6C reached for his water glass with his left hand, despite being right-handed. She'd noticed that detail during boarding, during her mental cataloging of passengers that happened automatically now, an unconscious survival mechanism. His dominant hand stayed beneath the tray table, concealed, ready. The third man, seated in 7B across the aisle, checked his watch again. Not anxiously, but with the practiced timing of someone synchronizing movements with partners. His eyes flicked toward Carlos, then away, then back again with the rhythmic precision of a metronome, counting down to detonation. The elderly couple in row 4 requested champagne, their anniversary celebration continuing in blissful ignorance. Aurelia poured Moet with hands that didn't shake, answering their questions about arrival time and ground transportation while her mind calculated distances, angles, potential interventions. The tech executive had fallen asleep with noise-canceling headphones, creating his own oblivious sanctuary. The fashion buyer scrolled through her phone, already mentally departed from this flight and planning her Milan meetings. None of them saw what Aurelia saw. The atmospheric pressure in the cabin shifted again. Not the aircraft systems, but something human and terrible, the tension of men about to commit violence at altitude, where witnesses were trapped and escape routes were limited to emergency exits that opened onto 40,000 feet of fatal nothing. The man in 6A stood, not hurriedly, with the casual confidence of someone heading to the lavatory, stretching his legs, moving through the cabin as though this were any routine flight. But his trajectory wasn't random. He moved with deliberate purpose toward the front of the aircraft, toward Carlos's seat, his path calculated to approach from the blind spot where even trained awareness struggled to track threats. Aurelia felt her pulse spike, tasted copper fear on her tongue. She continued pouring champagne, continued smiling, continued existing in the performance of normalcy while her mind raced through options like a computer running catastrophic failure scenarios. The man in 6C unbuckled his seatbelt. The metallic click seemed impossibly loud in Aurelia's heightened state, though no one else reacted. He stood more casually than his partner, reaching for the overhead compartment as though retrieving something. His jacket fell open slightly, and Aurelia caught the briefest glimpse of something dark and metallic tucked against his ribs. A gun, on a pressurized aircraft. The insanity of it, the sheer recklessness, told her everything she needed to know about how badly someone wanted Carlos Herrera dead. A bullet through the fuselage could decompress the cabin, kill everyone aboard. These men didn't care. Collateral damage was acceptable in their calculations. The third man remained seated but alert, his role becoming clear. He was watching for intervention, for air marshals or bodyguards, providing overwatch while his partners closed the trap. His hand moved inside his jacket, mirroring his partner's readiness. Carlos sat perfectly still in 2A, seemingly absorbed in his tablet, his whiskey untouched on the table before him. But Aurelia noticed the subtle change in his posture, the way his shoulders had drawn back fractionally, the slight angle of his head that suggested heightened awareness despite his manufactured calm. He knew. Her warning had activated something in him, some survival instinct honed through decades of living in a world where assassination was business strategy. The man from 6A passed row 4. Row 3. His hand drifted toward his jacket's interior, fingers splayed in preparation to draw whatever weapon waited there. Aurelia made her decision in the space between heartbeats. She pivoted from the elderly couple with their anniversary champagne, her practiced movements carrying her directly into the aisle with the beverage cart. Professional protocol dictated she should be in the galley, should be secured during potential turbulence, should never block the cabin's flow. But Aurelia had stopped following protocols the moment she'd whispered her warning to a Mafia boss. "Sir, would you care for a refreshment?" She addressed the man from 6A with bright professionalism, deliberately positioning herself between him and Carlos's seat. The cart served as a barrier, buying precious seconds. The man's eyes met hers, and Aurelia saw her death in them. Cold calculation, brief consideration of whether to eliminate her as an obstacle, tactical assessment of whether a flight attendant's murder would complicate the primary objective. She held his gaze with service industry pleasantness that revealed nothing of the terror flooding her system. "No, thank you." His accent was vaguely European, his tone dismissive. He moved to step around the cart, around her, his hand now fully inside his jacket. Aurelia reached for a glass of red wine. 14B had ordered it earlier, and in a movement that would seem accidental to any observer, she stumbled. The aircraft hit a patch of minor turbulence, a coincidental gift from atmospheric conditions, and the wine glass tumbled from her grip with perfect, calculated clumsiness. Burgundy liquid splashed across the man's chest, soaking his shirt, his jacket, dripping down his torso in dark rivulets that looked disturbingly like blood. The wine drenched his hand, the hand inside his jacket, forcing him to withdraw it reflexively to avoid ruining whatever weapon he carried. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." Aurelia's performance was flawless, her horror authentic enough because it stemmed from real fear channeled into acceptable expression. She grabbed napkins, began dabbing at the spreading stain, creating chaos and distraction in precious, life-saving seconds of confusion. The man from 6C had continued his approach, but Aurelia's manufactured accident had drawn attention. The elderly couple looked up from their champagne. The fashion buyer glanced away from her phone. Even the tech executive stirred slightly, his noise-canceling headphones not quite blocking the commotion. Witnesses. Suddenly, the clean assassination had an audience, and professional killers understood the liability of witnesses who could provide descriptions, testify, complicate the narrative of tragic in-flight incidents. In that fractured moment of distraction, Carlos Herrera moved, not frantically, but with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed escape scenarios until they became muscle memory. He stood, closed his tablet, and walked toward the rear of the aircraft with unhurried confidence. His path took him past the galley, past the lavatories, toward the aircraft's tail section where the crew rest area and additional facilities provided temporary sanctuary. The man Aurelia had doused with wine pushed her aside, no longer maintaining pretense. His partner from 6C abandoned his overhead compartment charade. Both men moved down the aisle with sudden urgency that shattered their careful facade of normalcy, revealing the predators beneath business-casual disguises. But Carlos had already disappeared into the aft section, the sound of a compartment door closing barely audible beneath the Gulfstream's engine hum. Aurelia stumbled backward against the beverage cart, her performance of flustered apology continuing even as her mind catalogued exits, counted seconds, calculated how long before violence erupted regardless of witnesses. Her hands shook now, not from fear alone, but from adrenaline's aftershocks, the physiological cost of controlled terror. The two men reached the aft section, their movements now openly aggressive. The man from 7B finally stood, abandoning his overwatch position, realizing their carefully orchestrated plan had collapsed into improvisation. All three converged on the rear of the aircraft, their body language transformed from patient hunters to frustrated predators who'd lost track of wounded prey. The elderly gentleman from row 4 touched Aurelia's arm. "Dear, are you all right? That was quite a spill." "I'm fine, thank you." Aurelia's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Just clumsy. The turbulence caught me off guard." She continued her performance, continued cleaning wine from the carpet with napkins that absorbed burgundy like bandages absorbing blood, all while tracking the three men through the reflective surfaces of windows and polished fixtures. They clustered near the lavatory doors, consulting in whispers too low to hear over the engines, their frustration palpable even from 20 feet away. One of them tried the crew rest compartment door. Locked. They exchanged glances, recalculating, weighing options that were rapidly diminishing. They couldn't force the door without creating a scene that would require captain intervention. Couldn't wait indefinitely at the lavatory like suspicious loiterers. Couldn't execute their mission with an audience that had already noticed their unusual behavior. The man Aurelia had drenched in wine turned, his eyes finding hers across the cabin's length. The look he gave her wasn't angry, anger would have been less terrifying. This was cold evaluation, professional acknowledgement that she'd interfered, mental notation that she'd become a complication requiring future resolution. Aurelia held his gaze for 3 seconds before looking away, before returning to her wine cleanup performance, before becoming invisible again through the act of service industry diligence. But those 3 seconds told her everything. She'd saved Carlos Herrera's life, at least temporarily, and in doing so, she'd marked herself for death. The three men returned to their seats with visible reluctance. Their synchronized mission deteriorated into aborted failure. They couldn't maintain their threatening presence without drawing more attention, couldn't access their target without creating catastrophic scene, couldn't complete their contract at altitude with witnesses and locked doors protecting their prey. But their retreat wasn't surrender. It was tactical withdrawal, strategic regrouping. The flight still had 6 hours remaining until London. The aircraft would eventually land. Carlos would eventually emerge from whatever sanctuary he'd found in the crew compartment. And when he did, these men would be waiting. Aurelia disposed of wine-soaked napkins in the galley waste compartment, her movements automatic while her mind spun through implications. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had involved herself in a world she'd only observed from safe distance, through reflective surfaces and peripheral vision, never direct engagement. The intercom chimed softly. "Aurelia, please come to the aft galley." The captain's voice, carefully neutral but with undertones that suggested he knew something had happened, even if he didn't know precisely what. She walked down the aisle on legs that felt disconnected from her body, aware of the 3 men tracking her movement, aware that every step carried her deeper into consequences she couldn't yet calculate. The elderly couple had returned to their champagne. The tech executive still slept. The fashion buyer scrolled through her phone, already mentally departed. None of them understood that this flight had become something other than transportation. It had become a trap suspended in sky, a container of violence delayed but not prevented, a pressure vessel holding threats that would eventually have to decompress. At the aft galley entrance, Aurelia paused, her hand on the bulkhead, her reflection visible in the polished surface. She looked the same neat uniform, professional appearance, controlled expression. But something fundamental had changed in the woman behind the reflection. She'd stepped out of invisibility and into visibility, out of safety and into danger, out of observer and into participant. And there was no returning to who she'd been before she whispered those 7 words to a Mafia boss. The crew rest compartment door opened a crack. Carlos Herrera's dark eyes met hers through the narrow opening, and in them she saw acknowledgement, calculation, and something that might have been respect or might have been the assessment of newly acquired asset. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice like gravel wrapped in silk, cultured yet dangerous, "about what happens when we land." The crew rest compartment was smaller than a confessional and twice as claustrophobic. Aurelia had been inside it countless times during long-haul flights, a narrow space with fold-down bunks, dim lighting, and barely enough room for 2 people to stand without touching. Now, with Carlos Herrera occupying half the available oxygen, it felt like a pressure chamber designed to extract truth through proximity alone. "Close the door," he said quietly. Aurelia hesitated, her training screaming warnings about confined spaces with dangerous men, about escape routes and witness protection and all the protocols that kept crews safe from passengers who might become threats. But she'd abandoned those protocols the moment wine spilled across an assassin's chest, and there was no returning to their shelter now. She pulled the door shut. The latch clicked with a finality that seemed to seal more than just physical space. Carlos stood with his back against the small sink basin, his tailored suit somehow still immaculate despite the chaos of the past 30 minutes. Up close, Aurelia could see details invisible from the respectful distance of service, the thin scar along his jawline, the silver threading through dark hair at his temples, the watchfulness in his eyes that never fully rested, even in seeming calm. "You know who I am," he said. Not a question, but acknowledgement of mutual awareness, the pretense of anonymity discarded like unnecessary luggage. "Carlos Herrera." Aurelia kept her voice steady, professional, as though introducing herself to any passenger despite the confined space and escalating danger. "I've seen your name on manifests before," heard the crew whispers. "And the men who want me dead?" His slight accent, Spanish inflected with years of international business, made the words almost conversational, as though discussing stock portfolios rather than assassination attempts. "I don't know who sent them." Aurelia's back pressed against the door, maintaining maximum distance in minimal space. "But they're professionals, patient, organized. They'll try again." Carlos studied her with an intensity that felt like physical examination, cataloging details, assessing value, calculating worth in whatever currency powerful men used when measuring human assets. "You intervened. Why?" The question hung between them in recycled air that tasted of coffee and expensive cologne. Aurelia had asked herself the same thing in the frantic minutes after her wine-spilling performance, had questioned the instinct that made her involve herself in violence between criminals who lived by rules she didn't understand. "I don't know," she admitted, the honesty surprising even herself. "Training, maybe. Flight attendants are taught to de-escalate situations, prevent harm. It's reflex." "Reflex." Carlos repeated the word like he was tasting it, testing its truth. "Most people's reflex when they see men like me threatened is to look away, to let nature take its course, to avoid becoming collateral damage in wars that aren't theirs." He wasn't wrong. Aurelia had watched countless situations unfold from safe distance, had maintained professional neutrality through passenger conflicts and tense moments, had perfected the art of service without involvement. Something about today had been different. Maybe it was the altitude, the trapped intimacy of shared airspace, the way violence at 40,000 feet felt more obscene than violence on solid ground. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe she'd just seen murder about to happen, and couldn't let it unfold without trying to prevent it, regardless of who was dying or why. "They saw you," Carlos continued, his tone shifting to something harder, more pragmatic. "The men, They know you interfered deliberately. Spilling wine in turbulence might seem accidental to other passengers, but professionals recognize intervention when they see it. The implications settled over Aurelia like ice water. She'd known it the moment wine-soaked eyes met hers across the cabin, had felt the weight of being noticed, being catalogued, being marked. But hearing it confirmed in Carlos's measured assessment made it real in ways her own fear hadn't managed. What does that mean? Though she already knew. Had known since her hand released that wine glass in calculated clumsiness. It means you're visible now. To them, to whoever sent them. Carlos straightened slightly, and in the confined space the movement brought him inches closer. To me. You've involved yourself in something considerably larger than a disrupted flight. I saved your life. Aurelia kept her voice level despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Yes, simple acknowledgement, neither gratitude nor resentment, just fact, which creates certain obligations on both sides. The word obligations carried weight that had nothing to do with thank you notes or monetary tips, everything to do with the underworld currency of debts and leverage and the complicated mathematics of survival in Carlos's realm. I don't want to be involved in your world, Aurelia said, though the protest felt hollow even as she spoke it. Involvement wasn't optional anymore. She'd stepped across that boundary the moment she whispered her warning, had sealed her participation when wine splashed across an assassin's chest. Carlos's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark eyes, not amusement exactly, but recognition of inevitable reality. Want is irrelevant now. Those men know your face. They'll report to whoever hired them. Your interference will be noted, investigated, weaponized against both of us. Weaponized? Aurelia's throat tightened. The clinical term made her interference sound strategic rather than instinctive, transformed her wine-spilling panic into calculated military action. You disrupted an operation that cost someone considerable money to arrange. Carlos's voice remained measured, educational almost, as though explaining market dynamics to an investor. 3 professionals on a private flight, weapons smuggled past security, coordination timed to the minute that represents significant investment. Someone paid for my death today, and you've denied them return on that investment. The mathematics of assassination. Aurelia had never considered murder as business transaction, violence as billable services rendered or denied. But Carlos inhabited a world where human life operated on balance sheets, where her interference represented financial loss to someone powerful enough to purchase death at altitude. The men were Konstantin Volkovs, Carlos continued, naming someone Aurelia had never heard of, but whose identity clearly mattered in the criminal calculus being performed. Russian syndicate. We've had territorial disagreements, oil refineries in Kazakhstan, shipping routes through the Black Sea, the usual friction points when empires overlap. He spoke of empires and territorial disputes with the casual tone most people use discussing neighborhood property lines. Aurelia felt reality tilting, the normal world of flight schedules and passenger service sliding away to reveal something darker beneath, a shadow economy operating in spaces she'd glimpsed but never entered. I didn't ask to be part of this, she said, hating how weak the words sounded, how irrelevant her protests were to the situation's momentum. No one asks. Carlos's expression softened fractionally, the first hint of something beyond cold assessment entering his features. But you acted anyway. That matters. In my world, actions define allegiances more reliably than intentions. Through the compartment's thin walls, Aurelia heard the muffled sounds of the cabin passengers settling back into their seats, the beverage cart rolling, normal flight operations resuming as though assassination attempts were minor turbulence rather than catastrophic events. The disconnect between those two realities felt insurmountable. What happens now? The question emerged smaller than Aurelia intended, carrying the weight of a future she could no longer predict. Carlos reached into his jacket, the same movement that hours ago had made the assassins reach for weapons, and withdrew a business card. Thick stock, embossed lettering, the kind of card that announced importance through texture and weight rather than garish design. He held it between 2 fingers, offering it like a contract written in compressed form. When we land in London, you have 2 options. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to presenting ultimatums as choices. Option 1, you disappear. I have resources, new identity, relocation, financial support to start over somewhere. Volkov's people won't find you. Eastern Europe, South America, Southeast Asia. You choose the continent. I arrange the details. You become someone else. Live quietly. Avoid attention for the rest of your life. Aurelia stared at the card without taking it, her mind struggling to process the casual offer of identity erasure. the suggestion that she could simply stop being herself and become someone manufactured for survival. That's witness protection. You're offering me witness protection. Better than witness protection. Carlos's slight smile held no warmth. Government programs have budgets, bureaucracy, limitations. I have none of those constraints. You'd be comfortable, safe, anonymous. And option 2? Though she suspected she already knew, understood that men like Carlos Herrera didn't present single choices but rather negotiations disguised as options. You work for me. The words dropped between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread outward into every aspect of Aurelia's existence. She'd expected the offer, had felt it building through their conversation like pressure before weather change, but hearing it stated plainly still sent her heart racing. Work for you doing what exactly? Aurelia kept her voice steady through sheer force of will, the same control that had kept her hands from shaking while pouring drinks for assassins. What you already do brilliantly: observe without being noticed, move through wealthy circles without attracting attention, travel internationally without raising flags. Carlos's assessment was clinical, evaluating her capabilities like assets on a spreadsheet. Flight attendants are nearly invisible to the kind of people I need intelligence on. You serve them drinks at 40,000 feet. They discuss mergers and territorial agreements and succession plans as though you're furniture that happens to pour wine. The logic was sound in a twisted way. Aurelia had heard countless confidential conversations over the years, had been treated as invisible by passengers who discussed affairs, business deals, criminal activities with the assumption that service staff didn't count as witnesses. She'd cultivated that invisibility deliberately, understanding it as job security in an industry where discretion was currency. Now Carlos wanted to weaponize that invisibility, transform her professional skill into espionage asset. And if I refuse both options? The question was pointless. She could read the answer in his expression, but she asked anyway, clinging to the illusion of choice even as it dissolved. Then you're vulnerable. Alone. Visible to people who eliminate complications with the same efficiency you've witnessed today. Carlos's tone wasn't threatening, just factual, presenting reality without embellishment. Volkov will identify you within 48 hours. Facial recognition, passenger manifests, crew databases. Then he'll send professionals more competent than the ones who failed today. And I won't be there to protect you. Protection. The word carried implications of ownership, of debt, of obligations that extended beyond simple employment. Aurelia understood instinctively that accepting Carlos's protection meant accepting his authority, entering a world where power dynamics operated by rules she'd never learned. The aircraft began its initial descent, the subtle pressure change announcing their approach to London airspace. 6 hours ago, Aurelia had boarded this flight as an air hostess, with student loans and a modest apartment in Queens. Now, she stood in a crew rest compartment, receiving job offers from a Mafia boss, her previous life evaporating like condensation on cabin windows. How long do I have to decide? Her hand remained at her side, the business card still suspended between them like a contract awaiting signature. Until we land. Carlos glanced at his watch. Platinum, probably worth more than her car. 37 minutes. Then you either take the card and call the number, or you walk away and hope you can disappear faster than Volkov can find you. 37 minutes to choose between orchestrated disappearance and deliberate involvement in criminal enterprise. Between invisibility as survival strategy and visibility as dangerous alliance. Between the woman she'd been and whoever she might become. Aurelia took the card. The Connaught Hotel's private dining room existed in a different London than the one visible from street level. Here, Wealth whispered, rather than shouted. Power expressed itself through understatement, rather than ostentation. Aurelia sat across from Carlos Herrera at a table set for two, crystal and silver catching light from chandeliers that probably cost more than her annual salary. 24 hours had passed since the Gulfstream touchdown at London City Airport. 24 hours since Aurelia had walked through customs with Carlos's business card burning in her pocket like evidence of crimes not yet committed. 24 hours of sleepless deliberation in her crew hotel room, weighing futures she'd never imagined against a past that no longer felt safe to return to. Now, in this room where conversations were protected by wealth and discretion, Carlos presented her choice with the formality of a contract negotiation. You understand what disappearing entails, he said, pouring wine with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in luxury. New name, new history, new life constructed from documentation and carefully maintained fiction. You'd be comfortable financially, secure, protected, relocated somewhere with no extradition treaties and limited surveillance infrastructure. Aurelia watched the wine catch light, remembering another glass of wine spilling across an assassin's chest, the moment that had rewritten her reality. But I'd never be Aurelia Kensington again. No. Carlos's acknowledgement was neither sympathetic nor apologetic, just factual. Aurelia Kensington would cease to exist in any meaningful way. No contact with family, friends, former colleagues. No return to the United States. No continuation of your education, your career, anything connected to your previous identity. The enumeration of losses felt like watching her life itemized for auction. Aurelia thought of her mother in Connecticut, their weekly phone calls, the carefully maintained normalcy between them despite the years of distance. Her graduate program at NYU, the degree she'd been working toward in fragments stolen between international flights. The small circle of friends who knew her laugh, her history, her ambitions beyond serving drinks at altitude, all of it would disappear, replaced by manufactured substitutes that would never quite feel real. And the alternative? Though she'd heard it already, needed to hear it again, needed the choice articulated clearly before she committed to a path that would define everything that followed. You work for me, under my protection. Carlos set down his wine glass with precision that suggested every movement was calculated. You continue as a flight attendant that cover is too valuable to abandon, but you also become my eyes and ears in spaces where my presence would attract attention. Industrial espionage. Aurelia named it plainly, stripping away the euphemistic language. Intelligence gathering. Carlos's correction was subtle but significant. Corporations spy on each other constantly. It's called competitive analysis. I simply operate in markets where stakes are higher and consequences more immediate. The rationalization was smooth, practiced, the kind of moral gymnastics that probably allowed him to sleep at night despite running an empire built on activities she could only partially imagine. But Aurelia had stopped judging hours ago, had moved past the luxury of moral certainty into the pragmatic territory of survival. What would you require from me specifically? Her question was professional, focused, the same tone she used clarifying passenger meal preferences or arrival transportation. Carlos leaned back, studying her with the same intensity he'd displayed in the crew rest compartment, evaluating value, calculating potential return on investment in human assets, passenger conversations, travel patterns, business connections. The wealthy are careless with information around service staff. They discuss mergers, territorial expansions, succession plans, criminal investigations. You'd simply remember those conversations, report them accurately. Simply. The word tasted bitter. Nothing about this was simple, not the moral complexity, not the danger, not the transformation from observer to participant in criminal enterprise. You'd be compensated generously, £10,000 monthly, plus expenses. Bonuses for information that proves particularly valuable. Carlos named the figure casually, as though discussing routine employment rather than purchasing her complicity. £10,000. Aurelia's mind calculated automatically nearly $15,000, more than double her current salary. Student loans eliminated within a year. Financial security her family had never known. The resources to become someone who didn't live paycheck to paycheck while serving champagne to people who spent more on watches than she earned annually. The temptation was deliberate, calculated to appeal to practical realities beneath moral objections. And if I'm caught? If airlines discover I'm reporting passenger conversations? If intelligence services identify me as compromised? The risks felt enormous. Career ending at minimum, potentially criminal depending on whose laws applied. You won't be caught. Carlos's confidence was absolute. I've operated this network for 15 years. Proper protocols, careful communication, layers of protection between you and anyone investigating. Your risk is minimal if you follow procedures precisely. If, the conditional carried weight, suggested consequences for deviation from established protocols, implied that protection was contingent on obedience to rules she hadn't yet learned. Aurelia looked at the wine in her glass, the crystal, the luxury surrounding her like insulation from normal world consequences. She thought about the 3 men on yesterday's flight, their cold efficiency, the clinical way they'd prepared to commit murder at 40,000 feet. Thought about Konstantin Volkov, a name she'd never heard before yesterday, and the resources required to identify one flight attendant among thousands globally. Carlos was right about her vulnerability. Refusing his offer didn't mean returning to her previous life unchanged. It meant hiding, running, constantly watching for threats she wouldn't recognize until too late. Meant abandoning everything she'd built over 5 years of careful work and calculated sacrifice. Or she could accept his protection, enter his world deliberately rather than as perpetual fugitive, gain resources and knowledge instead of remaining vulnerable target. The choice wasn't between good and evil. That binary had dissolved the moment she'd warned a mafia boss about assassins. The choice was between different versions of compromise, different calculations of acceptable risk, different futures built on foundations she'd never imagined standing on. "I'll do it." The words emerged quieter than Aurelia intended, but no less definitive. "I'll work for you." Carlos's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark eyes, satisfaction maybe, or recognition of expected outcome, or simple acknowledgement of completed transaction. He raised his wine glass in subtle salute. "Then we begin with rules." His tone shifted to educational, instructional, the voice of someone accustomed to training assets in survival protocols. "First rule, trust no one completely, including me. Loyalty is business arrangement, not emotional bond. Understand that distinction." Aurelia nodded, the cynicism both refreshing and chilling in its honesty. "Second, observe without participation. You gather information, report accurately, but never involve yourself in operations beyond your designated role. Yesterday's intervention was necessary exception. Don't make it habitual." The irony wasn't lost on Aurelia. Her intervention had created this situation, and now she was being instructed never to intervene again. Third, communication happens through designated channels only. No direct contact unless emergency protocols activate. You'll receive a secure phone, encryption software, dead drop locations. Memorize procedures, follow them precisely. The terminology dead drops, encryption, emergency protocols belong to spy novels rather than her lived experience. But Aurelia listened carefully, understanding that her survival now depended on mastering languages and procedures she'd never needed before. Carlos continued outlining rules, each one adding layers to the architecture of her new existence. How to recognize surveillance, when to abort information gathering, whom to contact if compromised. The careful choreography of living double life, balancing public performance against hidden reality. As he spoke, Aurelia felt the woman she'd been receding, replaced by someone harder, more calculating, more aware of dangers previously ignored through deliberate invisibility. She'd crossed a threshold, accepted protection that came with price, chosen alliance over isolation. There was no returning to who she'd been before yesterday's flight. That Aurelia had died somewhere over the Atlantic, replaced by this version sitting across from a mafia boss, learning rules of survival in worlds she'd only glimpsed through reflective surfaces. The wine tasted different now, richer, more complex. Or maybe she'd just learned to notice flavors that had always been there, hidden beneath assumptions of normalcy she could no longer afford. 3 months into her new existence, Aurelia Kensington had learned to live in the spaces between identities. By day, she remained the consummate professional, polished uniform, practiced smile, the invisible presence that poured champagne and collected empty glasses while wealthy passengers discussed their lives as though she were automated service rather than human witness. But now she listened differently, heard differently, cataloged conversations with the trained precision Carlos had cultivated through careful instruction. The Dubai to Geneva flight carried particular interest this Tuesday afternoon. Seat 3B held a petroleum executive whose company was negotiating pipeline rights through territories Carlos controlled indirectly. Seat 5A contained a banker whose institution laundered money for 3 competing syndicates, his loyalties as fluid as the accounts he managed. Seat 7C was empty, but the passenger manifest showed a last-minute cancellation that suggested someone had received warning about who else would be aboard. Aurelia served drinks, collected meal preferences, maintained the performance of normalcy, while her mind assembled intelligence from fragments of overheard conversation. The petroleum executive discussed infrastructure complications in Kazakhstan with his assistant code she'd learned to recognize for bribery negotiations with local officials. The banker checked his phone obsessively, encrypted messages arriving at intervals suggesting time-sensitive transactions in progress. She photographed the banker's phone screen during turbulence, a practiced move that looked like steadying herself while actually capturing data for Carlos's technical team to analyze. The executive's briefcase remained open beneath his seat, documents visible enough for Aurelia to note company letterhead and meeting schedules that would help Carlos anticipate competitive moves. This was her value now. Not dramatic intervention or heroic action, but patient observation, careful documentation, the steady accumulation of intelligence that powerful men could weaponize for profit and territorial advantage. The secure phone Carlos had provided buzzed against her hip as the aircraft began its descent into Geneva. A single word appeared on the encrypted screen: priority. Aurelia's pulse quickened. 3 months of routine reporting, and this was her first priority designation, information valuable enough to warrant immediate attention rather than standard weekly briefings. She waited until passengers had deplaned before accessing the plane's secure Wi-Fi, connecting through VPN protocols she'd memorized, uploading photographs and audio recordings to servers whose locations she'd never know. Carlos's operation functioned on compartmentalization. She gathered intelligence but never saw how it was analyzed, deployed, monetized in the complex marketplace of criminal enterprise. Her phone buzzed again. New message. London tomorrow. Usual location. 14. The Connaughts' private dining room had become their regular meeting space. Neutral territory where wealth provided insulation from surveillance and discretion was guaranteed through prices that excluded casual observers. Aurelia had grown accustomed to these debriefings, the careful dance of reporting without revealing how the process affected her, maintaining professional distance from activities her information enabled. But recently, something had shifted in their dynamic. The strictly transactional relationship, her intelligence for his protection and payment, had developed complications neither acknowledged directly. Carlos treated her less like purchased asset and more like valued advisor, soliciting opinions beyond simple data reporting, trusting her judgment in ways that suggested genuine respect beneath calculated pragmatism. And Aurelia, despite her careful emotional compartmentalization, had begun to care whether he survived the territorial wars her intelligence helped him navigate. The realization troubled her during the flight to London, during the sleepless hours in her crew hotel where she'd stopped decorating with personal items, stopped pretending this was temporary accommodation, rather than the permanent rootlessness her new life required. She'd warned herself against precisely this complication, emotional investment in someone whose empire was built on violence she preferred not to examine too closely. But proximity had consequences. 3 months of regular contact, of conversations that occasionally drifted beyond business into the territories of actual human connection, had eroded the careful distance she'd initially maintained. Carlos had revealed fragments of himself beyond the cold Mafia boss, his daughter's graduation from Oxford, his mother's decline into dementia in a Madrid care facility, the complicated grief of losing his wife to cancer 5 years prior, humanizing details that made him harder to categorize as simply dangerous employer, that complicated the moral mathematics Aurelia had constructed to justify her choices. The Connaughts' dining room felt different this time. Carlos stood when she entered, a courtesy he'd never extended previously, and his expression carried tension she'd learned to read as precursor to significant developments. "The intelligence you gathered from the Dubai flight was exceptionally valuable," he said without preamble, pouring wine with movements that betrayed unusual agitation. "The petroleum executive is planning to redirect pipeline contracts to Volkov's territory, cutting out my infrastructure entirely. Your photographs provided evidence we needed to renegotiate his loyalties." Aurelia accepted the wine, not asking what renegotiation entailed, understanding that her complicity was maintained through deliberate ignorance of consequences beyond information provision. But she couldn't entirely suppress the guilt flickering beneath professional satisfaction at having performed her role successfully. "There's been a complication," Carlos continued, his tone shifting to something harder. "The banker you photographed, Marcus Webb, was found dead this morning. Apparent suicide in his Geneva apartment, though circumstances suggest otherwise." The wine turned bitter in Aurelia's mouth. Was my information?" "No." Carlos's interruption was firm, definitive. "Webb was targeted by the Bratva, completely unrelated to your intelligence. But his death creates vacuum in financial operations that multiple syndicates will compete to fill, including Volkov." The name still sent ice through Aurelia's veins. Konstantin Volkov, the man who'd sent assassins onto that flight 3 months ago, who'd presumably identified her role in Carlos's escape, who existed in her mind as abstract threat, made real through Carlos's occasional warnings about heightened security protocols. "Volkov is making moves," Carlos said, confirming her fears. "Aggressive expansion, territorial challenges, attempts to compromise my networks. He knows about you now. Not your specific identity, but that I have intelligence assets among airline crews. He's been interviewing flight attendants, offering money for information about my travel patterns." Aurelia's hand tightened around her wine glass. The abstract danger had become concrete, immediate, personal. "What does that mean for me?" "It means we accelerate your training. You've been gathering intelligence, but now you need to learn active countermeasures, how to identify Volkov's recruitment attempts, how to feed disinformation when necessary, how to protect yourself if approached." Carlos's eyes held hers with unusual intensity. "It means the game has escalated, and you're no longer peripheral player but central asset in conflicts you didn't choose but can't avoid. The transformation was complete, Aurelia realized. She'd crossed from observer to participant, from passive intelligence gatherer to active operative in criminal warfare, whose rules she was still learning. The woman who'd boarded that Gulf Stream 3 months ago, the one who'd simply wanted to prevent murder through instinctive intervention, had been replaced by this version sitting across from a Mafia boss, discussing countermeasures and disinformation as though such language belonged in her vocabulary. "There's something else," Carlos said, and his tone carried weight that made Aurelia's stomach tighten. "Volkov has made inquiries about flight attendants named Aurelia. He doesn't have your surname yet, doesn't know which airline employs you, but he's narrowing the search. We have perhaps 2 weeks before he identifies you specifically." 2 weeks. 14 days before abstract threat became concrete danger. Before Konstantin Volkov's resources focused on her with the same lethal efficiency she'd witnessed on that Atlantic crossing. "What are my options?" Aurelia kept her voice level through force of will, the same control that had steadied her hands while photographing classified documents at 40,000 feet. "We can still disappear you. New identity, complete relocation, severing all connections to your previous life." Carlos presented the option without enthusiasm, and Aurelia understood that her value had grown beyond simple replacement. She'd become more than asset, she'd become investment he was reluctant to lose. Or, because there was always an or with Carlos, always another choice that involved deeper commitment rather than strategic retreat. Or we use Volkov's search as advantage. Let him find you, but under conditions we control. Turn his aggression into trap that eliminates his threat permanently. The suggestion was insane, suicidal, the kind of calculated risk that belonged in action films, rather than the lived reality of a 28-year-old flight attendant from Connecticut who'd stumbled into criminal enterprise through single act of intervening kindness. But Aurelia had stopped being that flight attendant months ago. She'd become someone harder, more dangerous, more willing to calculate acceptable risks in pursuit of survival. The shadows Carlos inhabited had become her shadows too. The empire he protected had become the structure supporting her existence. "Tell me the plan," she said, and watched something like pride flicker across Carlos's features, recognition that she'd crossed another threshold, accepted another level of complicity in the dangerous alliance between them. Outside the Connaught's windows, London continued its oblivious rhythm. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware of the criminal architectures operating in spaces they'd never see. Aurelia watched them with something approaching nostalgia for the person she'd been, the simpler existence she'd abandoned. But there was no returning to that simplicity. She'd chosen this path, accepted this alliance, become someone who gathered intelligence and discussed assassination plots with the same composure she'd once reserved for beverage service. The warning she'd whispered to Carlos Herrera had been more than intervention. It had been invitation into a world that would either save her or consume her entirely. And 3 months into this shadowed existence, Aurelia still wasn't certain which outcome waited at the end of choices she continued making, one calculated risk at a time. Carlos leaned forward, his voice dropping to the careful tone reserved for operational planning. "Volkov's weakness is predictability. He operates through established patterns. Recruitment follows specific protocols. Surveillance uses standard techniques. We exploit that rigidity." Aurelia listened as he outlined a plan that was equal parts brilliant and terrifying. She would continue her normal flight schedule, but Carlos's technical team would seed false information, suggesting she worked specific routes. When Volkov's people approached, and they would approach, she'd appear cooperative, vulnerable, exactly what they expected from a frightened asset caught between competing powers. But beneath that performance, she'd be gathering counterintelligence, identifying Volkov's network, documenting his operations with the same meticulous precision she'd used photographing the banker's phone. The hunter would become hunted, his search for Carlos's asset transformed into exposure of his own infrastructure. "The risk is considerable," Carlos acknowledged, reading the calculation in her expression. "Volkov's people are professionals. If they suspect deception, if you make single mistake in your performance, they won't hesitate to eliminate complications. Like they tried to eliminate you on that flight." Aurelia's voice was steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Exactly like that." Carlos's honesty was brutal, refreshing. "Which is why you need to decide now, before we commit resources, before Volkov narrows his search further. Disappearance is still option, safer, simpler, but Aurelia had stopped choosing safety the moment she'd involved herself in preventing murder at altitude. She'd crossed too many thresholds, accepted too many compromises, become too entangled in this world to extract herself through simple disappearance. And beneath the fear and moral complexity, she felt something else, a dark satisfaction at the prospect of turning predator into prey, of using skills she'd developed to strike back against threats, rather than simply surviving them. "I'll do it," she said, the same words she'd spoken 3 months ago, carrying different weight now. Not acceptance of employment, but commitment to warfare. Not choosing protection, but choosing to fight. Carlos nodded slowly, acknowledgement and warning combined. "Then we begin tomorrow. Your training accelerates surveillance detection, counterintelligence gathering, emergency protocols if situation deteriorates. You'll learn to operate not just as observer but as active participant." The distinction felt significant. Aurelia had spent 3 months learning to be invisible intelligence gatherer. Now she'd become visible operative, deliberately drawing enemy attention in service of larger strategic objective. The wine glass in her hand caught candlelight, burgundy liquid, dark as blood. Aurelia thought about the spilled wine that had started everything, the calculated accident that had saved Carlos's life and irrevocably changed her own. Full circle, in a way. From wine-spilling intervention to deliberate tactical operation. From frightened flight attendant to willing participant in criminal warfare. From Aurelia Kensington, who served drinks at altitude, to someone else entirely, someone she was still becoming. One dangerous choice at a time. "One more thing," Carlos said, his expression shifting to something almost uncomfortable. "After this operation concludes, assuming we both survive, your role in my organization will change. You've proven yourself valuable beyond initial expectations. That value comes with increased compensation, but also increased visibility within structures you've only glimpsed peripherally. Promotion," Aurelia realized. Not just asset but lieutenant, not just intelligence gatherer but trusted advisor in Carlos's empire. The prospect should have terrified her, should have sent her running toward that disappearance option while it remained available. Instead, she felt dark anticipation, recognition that she'd been moving toward this elevation since that first whispered warning. The shadows had been claiming her incrementally, each choice pulling her deeper until the distinction between her old life and new existence had blurred beyond recognition. "I understand," she said, and meant it. Understood the implications, the consequences, the point of no return she'd passed long ago without quite admitting it to herself. Carlos raised his wine glass in subtle salute, the gesture carrying finality. To survival, then, and to the interesting complications of unlikely alliances. Aurelia touched her glass to his, the crystal chiming softly. To survival. Outside, London's evening descended into darkness, city lights illuminating ordinary lives proceeding in comfortable ignorance of the criminal architectures operating in their midst. Aurelia watched the transition from day to night, symbolism not lost on her, the woman she'd been disappearing into shadow, replaced by whoever she was becoming in this world of territorial wars and calculated violence. The warning she'd whispered to Carlos Herrera had been beginning, not ending. Beginning of transformation she was still undergoing, of alliances she was still navigating, of a life that existed in shadows most people never saw. And 3 months into this dangerous existence, Aurelia Kensington had finally stopped pretending she wanted to return to the light. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and be part of a community that cherishes unforgettable tales like this one. Your support means more than you know. It fuels the creation of even more stories that speak to the heart. So, whether you're watching from your TV or your phone, take a moment to join us. Every like, every subscription, every share helps us continue bringing these stories to life. Thank you for being a part of this journey.